Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the final video in our 10-part video series in which we're learning to automate with vRealize Orchestrator. In the previous video, we learned how to create an Orchestrator workflow that creates virtual machines in vSphere. In this video, we will be continuing to create Orchestrator workflows, but this time we'll be working with different types of vSphere objects, such as clusters and hosts and data centers and so forth. Now, this video is not simply going to touch on vSphere type activities that you can automate in Orchestrator, but additionally, I'll be pointing you to resources that will help you to see how to automate other VMware products, such as vRealize Automation, vRealize Log Insight, and in general, how to automate using Orchestrator to automate any sort of IT system in your environment. Now, that's not going to be a deep dive into exactly how to do those different types of systems, but I will get you started in the right direction. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to create more workflows. We're going to be looking at the API Explorer. We'll learn how to search within vRealize Orchestrator. We're going to look at the API documentation that's available online. So we've got lots of topics to cover. One last thing before we do, jump in. If you take a look in the description down below, you'll notice that there's a time index for the various topics that we're going to be talking about. So if you're interested in a particular topic and want to jump straight ahead, feel free to do so. But we've got a lot of topics to cover, so let's jump in. Let's get started. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is build a lab environment for us to work in. The good news here is I don't have to build a lab environment from scratch. Instead, I'm going to leverage the hands-on labs at labs.hol.vmware.com. Now, I happen to note that the particular account I'm looking for has a specific number assigned to it, so I'm going to search for it by clicking All Labs. Then I'll search for 1821-05. Let me search for that. And as you can see, here's the lab. As you can see from the title, this lab is designed to teach you about vRealize Orchestrator. Now, we're not going to be going through the lab that's included in this lab environment. Rather, we're going to be using this lab environment to demonstrate our own things. Now, as you can see here, we're going to need to enroll in this course, and in order to do so, you need to have an account. As you can see in the top right-hand corner of the Hands-on Lab web page, there's a link you can click on to register for an account. I already have one, so I'm not going to need to do that. Instead, I'm just going to click on Enroll. And since I'm not logged in, I'm going to have to authenticate. I'll click Login. And now to actually start my lab, I'll click on the button labeled Start This Lab. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is that there is a lease period assigned to each of these labs. This particular lab has a 1 hour and 30-minute lease time, but I can, if I need to, extend that lease potentially multiple times by clicking on this Extend button. Now, as you can see, it takes a bit of time to build the lab. It's much faster, though, than building this lab from scratch. So what I'm going to do is either speed up or cut out this part of the video, because I don't think watching the lab environment be built is why you're here. The lab environment is now built, and though it perhaps looks like there's just one machine here, there are a multitude of machines in this environment. There's a vCenter server, there's an Orchestrator server, and probably other things like NSX and vRO and so forth. If you want to, go ahead and poke around behind the scenes to learn more about the lab environment, or maybe just read the readme.txt file that you see here. And in here, you'll find out information about the different machines in this lab environment. There we go. You can find out about the different machines in the environment. So as I said before, we've got vSphere, we've got vRO, we've got Log Insight, and so forth. And additionally, in this README file, there's also information about the credentials you would need to log into different machines in this environment. Additionally, in the VMware Hands-on Labs, over on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that there's a manual. And if I click forward on this one here, you'll notice that this particular lab has a number of different modules that you can go through to learn all sorts of things about vRealize Orchestrator. Now, for our purposes in this video, we're not actually going to be using the lab instructions as written, though I would encourage you after watching this video to perhaps start up this lab and go through their lab instructions. But instead, we're going to close this panel, and I'm going to maximize my screen here so that we can work more easily in our lab environment. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to start up the vRealize Orchestrator client, and I'll get logged in. So you can see the FQDN of our Orchestrator server on the screen, along with the default administrator username. I'm going to log in with our password. The password is in that README file, or you can simply type capital V, capital M, WARE1 exclamation point. By the way, from here on out, instead of saying exclamation point, I will use the shorthand bang. Now it's going to take a few moments for us to log into the vRO client, so I'll go ahead and speed up the video. And as you can see, we are now logged into the vRO client. I'm going to also start up, looks like I actually have an extra vRO client here. Let me close that one out. There we go. So I have my vRO client running, but I'm also, for reasons that'll become apparent in a little bit, I'm going to start up a web browser. And in here, I'm going to log in to both the vSphere web client, which is what this first link takes us to, and I'm also going to log into the HTML5 client. Again, these are vSphere tools. So I'll get started here by going into the vSphere web client. I'll log in. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for the HTML5 client. All right, so I'm logged into the web client, the HTML5 client, and the Orchestrator client. Now, part of why I'm doing that is right from the get-go, we want to make certain that you're aware that we can look at the vCenter inventory using any of those three tools. Just picking one, why don't we go for the vSphere web client? The vSphere web client, as we can see here, is actually still logging in. So let's instead go over to the HTML5 client. So in the HTML5 client, we can see our vCenter inventory. So we see our vCenter server, followed by a data center called region A01. And I'm just going to continue to expand this inventory somewhat. So we've got a cluster called region A01, compute 01. And in there we see 3 different ESXi hosts, along with some virtual machines. Now if I go over to the vSphere web client, there we go. So the vSphere web client is now logged in, and as you can see, I can see the exact same inventory. Now the screen looks a little different because these are different tools, but the inventory I'm looking at is the same inventory. I won't explain what all of these icons are because I just explained them and you already knew what they were anyways, but notice that whether I'm in the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client, I'm seeing the same inventory. Now I'm going to switch over to the Orchestrator client. And as you quite likely already know, there's this thing called the Inventory tab. So I'm going to go to the Inventory tab, and unlike those other tools, which are only showing us the vCenter inventory, we can see through Orchestrator's inventory lots of different systems out there in our environment and see what inventory of objects they have. But we're going to, for the time being, just focus on the vSphere portion of that inventory. And as you can see, I see the same vCenter server that we saw in those other 2 vSphere tools. And if I expand, well, things are looking a little different. For one thing, this entry here is the vCenter server. You might initially think this is the vCenter server because it's got the vCenter icon, but this is actually for the vCenter plugin in Orchestrator. This is my vCenter server And instead of just showing the name of the vCenter server, it's got the full API URL that you use to connect to a vCenter server. And then there's some folders here that you haven't seen before. This second one we're not going to worry about in this video. It has to do with policy-based management. It's irrelevant for our purposes right now. Instead, we're going to focus on this folder here called Data Centers. If we expand this Data Centers folder, we'll once again start to see some familiar things. So let me once again expand my inventory a bit. And while it's going out and performing an inventory of that host, of that cluster, there we go. So it's already done. Actually, that's not the cluster I want to see. We want to see the other cluster. So while we're waiting for it to examine that cluster and report back information, notice that we see the same icons that we saw in the vSphere clients, but there's some additional things that have been added into this inventory. Actually, that's not quite true. There's nothing new in this inventory that we're seeing in the vSphere web client. Instead, what's happening here is the Orchestrator client is showing us things that the vSphere clients don't show us. The vSphere clients don't show us this object here called data centers. That object exists in the vCenter inventory, but the vSphere web client and HTML5 client choose to hide that from you to simplify the display. But what that object is a data center folder. You perhaps have seen data center folders before. If you haven't seen them before, the basic idea behind data center folders is data center folders allow us to organize our data centers. Now, in this particular case, we only have one data center called Region 01, so we don't really need to organize it. But if you had a bunch of data centers, perhaps you have some in the Americas and other data centers in APJ and others in EMEA, you could create a different data center folder for each of those different locations, those different continents, so that you could organize your data center objects. So the data centers object is an object that exists by default. Whenever you install a vCenter server, you will have that data center folder called data centers, but it's hidden from you if you're using the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client. Those vSphere clients hide this level from you. In vCenter, when you create a data center, which you can see we have here called Region 01A, you will automatically end up with 4 different folders called Host, VM, Data Store, and Network. And like the Data Centers folder, these 4 folders are created by default whenever you create a data center, and those 4 folders, like the Data Centers folder, will be hidden from you in the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client. But let's continue expanding a bit more. In the host folder that we see here, you can see that the host folder contains our clusters. And if we expand our clusters, as you would expect in the clusters, we can see all the hosts and VMs. These are the same hosts and VMs that we see over in the vSphere clients, but they are in a slightly different hierarchical relationship here. Now again, you're probably used to the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client and the way it organizes these objects. You're probably not accustomed to seeing data centers or the host folder or the VM folder, or the data storage folder, or the network folder, but you need to get used to seeing them as an Orchestrator developer, because what you're seeing here in the Orchestrator client's view of the vCenter inventory is the actual structure of the vCenter inventory. The vSphere clients hide this stuff from you. But now that you know that this is here, the reason why I first wanted to bring you into this environment is to show you that you can work with this vCenter inventory from within Orchestrator. Now, the first way I'm going to do this is to run pre-existing Orchestrator workflows directly. Now, ultimately, that's not our goal. Ultimately, our goal is to teach you how to create your own workflows. But if we start with some existing ones, that's going to get us heading down the right path. So I'm going to switch from Run View to Design View. And in here, I know that there's a folder called Library, which contains different folders for each of the different plugins that we have installed. I'm interested in the folder called vCenter, because in the vCenter folder, we have a number of folders. Let me scroll down. There we go. We have a number of folders that are provided by the vCenter plugin that enable us to perform various vSphere type activities. And to begin with, what I want to do is show you how we could create a new data center folder using these workflows. But before you ever run somebody else's workflow, or especially when you are about to create your own workflow, it'd be a good idea to make certain that you know how to perform whatever task it is you're trying to automate. You ought to know how to do that manually using a tool such as, in this case, the vSphere client or the vSphere web client. Excuse me, the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client. So just to illustrate this here, if you've never done this before, I'm in the vSphere web client. If I want to create a data center folder, the way you do that is you select a vCenter server, right-click it, and simply say New Folder. If you right-click other objects elsewhere in this hierarchy and say New Folder, you'll end up with a different type of folder. But right-clicking the vCenter server and choosing New Folder will create a new data center folder. To illustrate that, I'll say New Folder, and notice it's only asking me one question. It just wants to know what the data center folder should be called. So I'm going to create one called My Data Center Folder. And I'll hit OK. And as you can see over here on the left side of the screen, we now have a data center folder called My Data Center Folder. And to drive home the point, if I go over to the HTML5 client, you'll notice that we see that data center folder exists here in the HTML5 client. And furthermore, if we go over into the Orchestrator client and go to its inventory, we can, well, where's that new data center folder? Well, in the case of Orchestrator, we're going to want to either click the refresh button, or typically faster, if you click reload, we'll more quickly see the change that's occurred here. So notice that I now have a new data center folder called My Data Center Folder. And the place that it's been positioned in our inventory is in the hidden folder called Data Centers. Any data center folder that you create will be some sort of child off of data centers. So this is working exactly as we'd expect, and we are now able to do what you probably already knew how to do, which is to use the vSphere web client or HTML5 client. Now, I want to show you how to do the exact same thing here in Orchestrator, but first I'm going to go over to the web client or the HTML5 client, either would work, and I'm going to get rid of that data center folder. So I'm going to remove it from inventory. Yes, I want to remove it, and it's gone. Okay, so as you can see here, the Orchestrator client has already detected that that particular VM folder is gone. What I'm going to do next is go to the Workflows tab, because I know that in the vCenter plugin, so Library vCenter, there's a folder here that contains a workflow that allows us to create a new data center folder. While you might be tempted to come into the data center folder, there's no workflow here for creating data center folders. These are all workflows that are related to data centers, which is not the same thing as a data center folder. So that's not the folder we want. That's not where we're going to find the workflow we want, but rather in folder management, there is a collection of workflows that allow you to create VM folders, host folders, and what we need for our purposes is data center folder creation. So I'm going to expand, and as you can see, in addition to being able to create a data center folder, we can also delete one or rename one. But I'm going to run this workflow to show you how you can use an existing Orchestrator workflow to create a data center folder. So to run the workflow, I will go up to the Start Workflow button, and you'll notice I'm being asked two questions. Now, one of the questions is just like we saw when we were using the HTML5 client or the vSphere web client. It asked us, what do we want to call our new data center folder? I'm going to choose the same name. But there's another question here that wants to know something about a parent folder. Now, parent folder, that may not make sense, but notice that the tooltip that pops up here tells us that what it's trying to get us to pick here is something called a vC:datacenter folder. So if we click here on the words not set, the tree browser, which I introduced you to earlier in the video series, I believe it was in video number 9, allows us to go browsing to find the type of object we're looking for. And just as a quick reminder, whenever you use the tree browser, always look in the title bar to see exactly what type of object you're trying to find. So it wants us to find a vC:datacenter folder. Currently, the thing we have selected is not a vC:datacenter folder, which is why the select button's grayed out. But I know that there is a data center folder in here somewhere. Is it this one here? No, the button's still grayed out. Select is still grayed out because this is not a data center folder. It's not a vC:datacenter. It's a data center, not a data center folder. So what we want to do is select this object. This is a vC:datacenter folder. It's called data centers, but strictly speaking, it's a data center folder. And you'll notice that our button has ungrayed, so we can select it. And we've now answered all the questions that we need to answer when running this workflow. And all we have to do is click submit, and in a few moments we'll see that the workflow is running, and we can see that the workflow has succeeded. And using any of the 3 different inventory browsing tools that we've been talking about, we can see that the data center folder was indeed created. Now, I'm not going to show you all 3 views, but in the Orchestrator client inventory, you'll notice that I once again have a data center folder called my data center folder, and it's positioned right here because this is the data center folder we selected when we ran the Orchestrator workflow. Now, I'll take you over to the web client, and you'll notice that in the web client, we don't see the data centers folder because that never shows up in the vSphere web client, but we do see the data center folder that we just created by running that Orchestrator workflow. Now, at this point, you're probably asking yourself, why are we running existing workflows? The reason why I want you to see us running existing workflows to understand the mechanics of what we're trying to create here. We're going to be creating a workflow that not only creates a data center folder, but it's going to create other types of objects such as data centers, clusters. We'll create a workflow that's going to add a host to that cluster, and so forth. So to do that, we'll begin by going to the Workflows tab. And in the Workflows tab, let me collapse some things here. Just as a matter of good practice, I'm not going to put my workflows in any of the existing folders that VMware's created. Instead, I'm going to right-click this top-level object here and choose to add my own folder. I'm going to call my folder VVork. Obviously, you can call your folder something else. Now that we're familiar with how to call the vCenter plugins workflows in Orchestrator, let's see how we can create our own workflow to do various tasks. So ultimately what we're going to be doing in this particular example is creating a workflow that's going to build a vCenter inventory. It'll start by creating one of those data center folders. Then we'll create a data center. Next we'll create a cluster, and then we'll actually add a host to that cluster. So let's get started. So to create a workflow, as you know, I'm going to right click on my folder and choose New Workflow. And then I'll name my workflow. Then, as always, the first thing I should do is type a good description here. Since somebody else may be calling my workflow, they'll want to know what it does. Okay, so we've created our workflow and have given a description. Our workflow doesn't do anything yet, so what we're going to do first is go to the Schema tab. And at the Schema tab, if we want to, we could create this workflow from scratch, writing all sorts of JavaScript code, but as you know, there already are workflows to do the types of things we want to do. So to call a workflow, we can scroll down in the generic section of the schema palette. We can scroll down to workflow element. If we drag workflow element into our workflow, the first thing it's going to do is ask us to type the name or a portion of the name of the workflow that we want to call. I happen to know, and you know, that there's a workflow called create data center. It's actually called create data center folder, but I'll just type a portion of the name. And as you can see here, we have create data center folder. If I select the workflow by clicking it once, I get a pop-up window that gives me information about the workflow. So does this sound like the right workflow? Yep, it's got the right name, that's the right version. Crucially, you probably want to take a look at the folder, because sometimes there will be workflows with the same name that are being brought into Orchestrator by different Orchestrator plugins. So double check the folder description. If nothing else, I always look at the name and the folder just to double check. To actually select this workflow, I'm going to double click it. And as you can see here, our workflow now currently has a single schema element that's going to call create a data center folder. But right now, that workflow's not ready to be called because I need to hook up its inputs and outputs. I can do that a variety of different ways. You know that I could go to the in-out tabs or the visual binding tab, or I could go to the setup wizard in the top right-hand corner. But for the time being, we're going to stick with the visual binding approach. So if we go to visual binding, as you can see, we see the usual visual binding. I can't quite see everything unless I scroll down. So I'm going to actually undock the pane on the bottom. So it's now undocked, and I can see, if I look at this information here on the screen, I can see, let me resize things a bit here. I can see that the workflow that we're trying to call from our workflow has two input parameters. One is the parent folder, I'll explain that in a moment, and the other is the name. And as a reward for our hard work, it's going to give us back a vC::data center folder object. So taking a look here, name is easy. That's just the name of the new data center folder. So to do that, we could either create an input parameter, in which case the user will get to pick the name of the new data center folder, or we could create an attribute, in which case we, the developer, get to pick the name of the new data center folder. For our purposes here, why don't we allow the end user to pick? So we'll create an input parameter. As you can see here, the window that pops up allows us to pick a name of the variable. You'll notice that the default name that we get is the default name that we get is exactly the same as the name of the variable inside of the workflow that we're calling. Now, that name is sufficiently unambiguous for create data center folder, but in our workflow, we're going to have names for all sorts of different things, like name of data center folder, name of data center, name of cluster, name of host. So I'm going to change this name slightly here. I'm going to change it to data center folder name. That default description looks fine. Since I'm hooking up to his variable, I don't get to pick the type or how many strings this is. It's just going to be a single string. It's an input parameter, so the user is going to set the value. We, the developer, will not. All right, so we click OK, and we have the first of our parameters bound. Now this parameter, parent folder, needs to have a vC::data center folder. In other words, this variable is what's going to instruct the workflow that we're calling where we want our new data center folder positioned. So to hook this up, again, I could ask the end user to specify the parent folder, and maybe in some workflow I'd want to do that. But in this case, I'm not going to have the end user pick the parent folder because that might just confuse them. So instead, I'm going to set this up as an attribute. I'll click and drag to the lower left-hand corner. And again, as you're about to discover here, we're going to have multiple parent folders, so I'm going to disambiguate this a bit by changing its name. I'm going to call this variable parent data center folder. And again, the default description and everything else looks fine here, except for this value. Unlike the input parameter we set up a few moments ago, we're going to need to set this input parameter. I can either do that right now by clicking on Not Set, and setting its value, which I'm about to do. Or if I don't set the value now, or if I change my mind what I want the value to be, I can always go to the General tab, scroll down to the Attributes section, and configure the variable, change its value. But I'm going to go ahead and set the value now. So if we click Not Set, you'll notice that we see a familiar interface here. This is the tree browser. Whenever going into the tree browser, first thing you should do is look at the title bar to see what type of object we're searching for. Until we find that type of object, the select button is going to remain grayed out. So let's go find a vC:datacenter folder. So we'll expand and expand, and this here, data centers, is a data center folder. Our select button is ungrayed, and if this is in fact where we want the new data center folder to show up, we'll just select data centers and click select. Everything looks good here, so we'll click OK. And now all that's left to do is to configure this output parameter from the workflow that we're calling. We want to save this output parameter either as an output parameter in our workflow or as an attribute in our workflow. Now, in the beginning of your career as an Orchestrator developer, you're going to be tempted to create output parameters, and when you need an output parameter, that's a good thing to do, create output parameters. But in the beginning, I recommend that you fight the temptation to set everything up as output parameters and instead set them up as attributes. Now, we'll talk in some other video. In fact, I already have another video that talks about why that is. But I'm going to set this up as an attribute, and as I do so, I'm going to first of all create as an attribute. I'm going to give it a new name. So this is our new data center folder. Again, I'm changing the name here because we're going to have potentially multiple types of folders, so I'm being explicit here. And in this particular case, again, the description's fine. The type I don't get to change because I'm hooking up to his variables. I don't get to choose input parameter versus attribute here because I just dragged and dropped into the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner. But I do have the opportunity to set the value of this new attribute. Now, the other attribute that we just created called parent data center folder, we set the value. In this case, I'm not going to set the value because the workflow that I'm calling is going to programmatically set the value of this attribute. So that's a thing that you'll commonly see is whatever outputs you save from a workflow that you're calling, you set them up as an attribute, and you tend not to set their values because the workflow or the action that we're calling is going to do the setting for us. Okay, so everything looks pretty good here so far. Let's just double check. Yep, that all looks good. I'll close this window. I'll save my workflow, and I'm going to validate my workflow. It's a pretty simple workflow so far, so I don't expect any problems. The workflow looks good. We'll close the validator, and we're going to run this workflow. Now, as we run this workflow, we're only asked one question because there's only one input parameter. So it wants to know the name of the new data center folder. So let's create a data center folder called my data center folder. And if we click submit, actually just before we do, to prove that this is actually doing something, either in the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client, either would work. I'm just going to go in there and show that currently we don't have a personalized data center folder. We do have a data center folder called data centers, but you guys know that that one's hidden by default. But after we run this workflow, we should expect to see a data center folder called my data center folder showing up in between these two objects. So let's actually run this workflow. We'll click submit. The workflow runs. The workflow has completed successfully. And if we go over to the vSphere web client, as you can see, we have a new data center folder called my data center folder. So if we expand there, there's nothing in it, which brings us to the next part of our workflow. So in the next part of our workflow, what we want to do is to create a data center. As you might imagine, or you might recall, you've actually already seen that there's a workflow called create data center. That's not the one we just called. We just called create data center folder. there is a workflow called create datacenter that will do what we're trying to do next. And therefore, we could just drag out one of these workflow calling schema elements, tell it the name of the workflow that we want to call, and we'd be in good shape. But I wanted to show you a few different ways to specify or to identify which workflow you want to call. So to do that, I'm going to go down, this is one technique. I'm going to go down to the All Workflow section. And as you go in here, you'll notice that it has a familiar interface that we've seen before. And if we go into Library, then down to vCenter, there is a folder called datacenter. And in there, there's the workflow that we want to call. It's called create datacenter. And again, we could just drag this workflow out, drop it into our schema, and notice this time the little search window didn't pop up to ask us the name of the workflow because we just specified which workflow we want to call. So we don't have to do the search window thing again, but what we do have to do is hook up this workflow just like you do anytime you call somebody's workflow. So once again, we want to look at the contract for the workflow we're calling. So here's create datacenter. That's the workflow that we're going to call. And the contract specifies that we need to specify a folder. It looks like it's the same type of folder. We'll double check that in a moment. We need to specify the name of the data center that we want created. And we need to set up either an output parameter, although you know I'm going to instead create an attribute. But either by creating an output parameter or an attribute, we're going to save the new data center that gets created. So let's do the simple part first. The name of the new data center, we're just going to ask the user to specify the name of the data center. And as you know, we'll do that by creating an input parameter. So here's data center name. And this folder, let's be real careful here that this is the type of folder we think it is. Once again, without scrolling, I can't see the whole visual binding window, so I'm going to undock. And let's see here. I'll select folder, and notice that in this case, the folder variable in this case is the name of the data center folder in which the new data center should be created. So we're going to go looking for a data center folder. Again, the user probably doesn't understand that. If they did and I wanted to give them control, I could create an input parameter. But since the user probably doesn't understand what a data center folder is, and since I may not trust them to set that value, I'm going to create an attribute. Again, we are going to end up having multiple folders. So let's see here. Parent data center folder. Well, why don't we call this one data center folder? Now, wait a sec. If I recall correctly, we just called a workflow that creates a data center, and it stores that new data center in a variable called new data center folder. But as you can see here, Orchestrator sees that there's something not quite right going on here. Whenever you go into this window, the create parameter window, you are creating a new output parameter, input parameter, or attribute. And therefore, this new variable has to have its own unique name. New data center folder is not a valid choice here because that variable already exists. So in other words, we don't actually need to create a new variable, we just need to bind to the existing variable. Now in this particular case here, it's Orchestrator is just indicating with the red shading here that there's a problem with this variable. In other circumstances in the same window and other windows like it, you'll sometimes see Orchestrator put a number on the end of a variable. It's kind of like when you duplicate a file in Windows, it creates a file called copy of original file name. Orchestrator is doing the same type of thing here. It knows that new data center folder already exists, and if Orchestrator is slapping a number on the end of the variable name, that means that Orchestrator is trying to help you by creating a unique variable name. Although in my experience, although Orchestrator is trying to help you by slapping the number on the end of the variable, in my experience, at least with people who are new to Orchestrator, that actually causes more confusion than just complaining like we see it doing here. If you ever see Orchestrator sticking a number on the end of a variable, like I'm illustrating here, you probably should not accept that variable name, because if you do so, for instance, in this case, we would end up with a variable called new data center folder. That's the existing variable. And we would end up with an additional variable called new data center folder 1. We'd have two variables when we really only want to have a single variable. So if you say OK to this new variable name, you're going to end up with two variables, and you're going to have to clean things up later on. So even though Orchestrator is trying to be nice, when Orchestrator slaps a number on the end of a variable, you should probably just stop and go look at your variables and figure out why is there a conflict. Should I be connecting to another variable, an existing variable like we have in this case, or it could just be an accidental collision in the names of your variables. But we're not going to create a new variable called new data center folder because we already have that. In fact, we're going to cancel out of the create parameter wizard entirely, because this folder, this vC::data center folder that we need to pass into the create data center workflow, that variable already exists in our workflow. So let's go find it. It's not up here. Oh, wait, hang on, here we go. We have two different variables. If you look down in the bottom portion of the visual binding window, you can actually see a description of these variables. So this variable here is called parent data center folder, and there's another one called new data center folder. They are both vC::data center folder variables, which is good. Since that's the right type, we could potentially bind to either of these, but the first choice here, parent data center folder, is not the one that we want to choose. It's a valid one to choose, it's just the wrong choice. If you would like a little pop quiz for yourself, pause the video and think about that for a few moments. Why is this variable, parent data center folder, not the one we want? Okay, welcome back. I'm going to link up to new data center folder. The reason why I'm linking up to new data center folder is that I don't want my new data center to be created in the hidden default data center folder called data centers. I want this new data center created in my data center folder that just, in the previous part of this workflow, that data center folder got created. So we've set up our inputs. Now we've got an output. Again, as a beginning Orchestrator developer, fight the temptation to create an output parameter. Instead, create an attribute. If you create it as an attribute, you're going to have complete flexibility over what you do with this variable. And if you do need to pass out the value of this variable to your end user, you can simply copy that attribute to an output parameter at the end of your workflow. So I'm going to create a new data center as an attribute. The default name here seems pretty good, so I'm going to go with that. The description's fine. You know that I can't change these things, but what I could potentially do is set the value. Again, a little pop quiz. You might want to hit pause and ask yourself, why is Brian not setting the value here? I'm going to continue on. The reason why we're not setting the value here is because the workflow we're calling is going to programmatically set the value, so we don't need to set it. Okay, so everything looks good here. We've got our inputs connected. We've got our output connected. I'm going to click the X button to close that window. I'll validate my workflow. Workflow is valid. I'll close the validator. And when I run this workflow, when you run a workflow from within the editor, it will automatically populate the input parameters that we're asking for with whatever value we specified the previous time we ran this workflow. So the previous time we ran this workflow, we specified the name of the data center folder that we want. It is called my data center folder. This field is blank here because we've never asked for the name of a new data center. But I'm going to say my data center. I'm just about to hit submit, and I'm going to watch this workflow blow up. And again, hit pause if you want to test yourself. Why is this workflow about to blow up? Let's click submit, and again, the workflow is going to blow up. Here it comes. The workflow has blown up. Now I know it's blown up because the schema element here has turned red. And I know that when those turn red, I can go over to the tabs over here on the right side to see what's going on. You may have noticed I just tried to resize the pane over here on the right because I'm trying to see more information. But whenever this setup wizard's here, you can't shrink this any smaller than I've got it, unless of course you want to dismiss the setup wizard, which you may not want to do. It's hard to get back when you delete it. But I've done it in this case because I don't want the setup wizard right now. Instead, I wanted to be able to see more of what's going on in here. So under variables, we can see information about all the variables and their values. These are all our input parameters, output parameters, and attributes in our workflow. But crucially, what I came into the variables tab to see is this exception message. And the message here is the name my data center folder already exists. This is an example of a thrown exception message. In other videos, I talk about how to throw exceptions and go into more information about exception handling. But for our purposes here, if we look at this exception message, this is a very nice exception message. It tells you exactly what the problem is. Not all exception messages are this easy to understand. If you see an exception message and you don't quite understand, don't immediately start blaming Orchestrator, because many times the messages that you get in this exception area are not coming from Orchestrator. For instance, in this case here, the message is actually coming from the vSphere Web Services API. This is a message coming from your vCenter server. So if you have a more complex message and you're trying to figure out what it means, you might want to go Googling for that exception message. Don't add the word Orchestrator into your search terms, because this is probably, I know in this case it's not, but in many cases this is not an Orchestrator message. Adding Orchestrator to the search term is just going to make it harder to find the message you're looking for. So the problem here, the reason why this workflow blew up, is because we've already got a data center folder called my data center folder, and vCenter doesn't allow you to have two folders with the same name at the same place in the hierarchy. Now, the correct way to handle this would be to set up exception handling in our workflow, but that's a subject for another video or series of videos. Exception handling is a very important thing to understand how to do, but we're not going to tackle that today. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the vSphere web client or the HTML5 client, and I'm just going to simply manually remove that data center folder. And every time I run my workflow, I'm going to have to do that. But that's okay. I'll say remove from inventory. I'll say yes. And that folder's gone now. That data center folder's gone. If we try to run the workflow again, all of our input parameters already have values pre-assigned to them. These were cached from the last time we ran the workflow. We'll click submit, and this time when the workflow runs, hang on, there we go. So the workflow ran, we can see all the values of the different variables. Looks like it ran successfully, and therefore if we go over to the vSphere web client, we should be able to see our new data center folder. Here it is, and if we expand that data center folder, there's my new data center, which is currently empty. We want to put something in there. So as you know from vCenter in general, the thing that comes beneath a data center is a cluster, like we see here. So I want to add a cluster to my newly created data center. Now to do that, I'm going to need to go back to Orchestrator, and you can probably guess the name of a workflow for creating a data center. It's just called create data center. But again, as I said before, I want to show you multiple ways to find workflows to call. So I'm going to, for the time being, save and close this workflow so that I can get back to this main screen where under Tools, I can choose to do a search, or you can hit F3. So if I do a search, I can do different types of searches. For right now, we're going to look for elements that match the following, elements whose name match what I'm about to type. Those elements could be workflows, they could be actions, but what I'm looking for is one that will create a cluster. Now I happen to know that that's the name of the workflow. So it found the workflow. I hit enter, which did a search, and there's the workflow. But imagine, if you will, you didn't know exactly the name of the workflow. You knew you wanted to create a cluster, but you don't know whether it's create cluster, add cluster, new cluster, hocus pocus cluster. You don't know because you're searching for it. So in cases like that, just search for the thing that you're trying to work with. In this case, it's a cluster. Again, I'll click search. And in this case here, it not only found create cluster, it found a whole bunch of other workflows for creating, not just creating clusters, but doing various things to clusters. Similarly, you can oftentimes find it useful to search for the type of action you want to perform. So let's see what kinds of things we can create. So we can create an address book in XML and so forth. So lots of different choices here, but the one we're looking for is create cluster. If we say search, it finds create cluster. And if we select create cluster and click go to selection, it, in the background, just went to that workflow. There's create cluster. And if we wanted to, we could then go check out that workflow's input parameters so that we can understand how this workflow works, and its output parameters. At a minimum, that's what I need to know about this workflow. What are its inputs? What are its outputs? But if I wanted to dig in deeper, I could go to the General tab to, let me collapse this top section. I could go to the General tab to see what attributes that workflow is using. Strictly speaking, if I'm calling somebody else's workflow, I don't have to know what their attributes are, but sometimes it can be interesting to see. And similarly, I don't have to understand their schema, but it might be worthwhile popping over here and looking at their. Okay, so let's go back again to our workflow. So we know the name of the workflow we want to call is called create cluster. Now I need to find my workflow again. There's mine. I'm going to edit my workflow. And again, the next thing we want to do is call a workflow called, whoops, dropped it a little too soon there. So drag and drop. We're going to call a workflow called create cluster. There's only one of those, but I'm going to double check. Yep, that's the right name. Yep, that's the right folder. So this looks good. I'll double click it. And once again, I need to hook up this new workflow's input parameters and output parameters. Again, for the same reason as I said before, I'm going to undock the pane down below. And I'll just reposition this here so you can see what I'm doing. So here we are. We're looking at the create cluster workflow that we're calling. And as you can see here, Orchestrator has already attempted to set up a binding for us. So the create cluster workflow has a variable that's used for storing the name of the cluster that we want created. It's a string. And just by doing string matching, Orchestrator has attempted to guess which variable should be bound. Now, in many cases, that binding will be perfect. It'll be exactly correct. But in some cases, like this one, the binding that was automatically set up is not going to be right. So whenever you see an automatically set up binding, you should do what I'm about to do, which is to double check, is this right? So this variable here, if we look down on the bottom, says that this is the name of the new cluster, and it got bound automatically to a variable over here called datacenter folder name. No, that's not the right variable. It's the right type, but it's not the right variable to connect to, because I want my cluster name to be something different from the datacenter folder name or the datacenter name. So neither of these variables, even though they're strings, neither of these is the right one. So I'm going to actually sever this binding, which I can do either by clicking on the red X here, or since it's an input parameter, you could go over to the end tab, find that variable, and in here you can actually change the binding. I like working in the visual binding tab, so I'm just going to work over here, hit the red X. Now nothing's bound, and I need to do some binding. So to do that binding, let's see, I've been letting the user set other names. Why don't I let him set the name of the cluster? So I'm going to do that by creating an input parameter. I'll call this variable cluster name. And for reasons we've talked about before, I'll leave everything at their default values. And let's see, what else do we need here? Why don't we do the out? You can do these in any order. I'm going to go over here to the output parameters. Let's see, the output of this create cluster workflow is a vc: cluster compute resource. So in other words, the attribute I'm about to set up here is the new cluster that this workflow is creating. Again, the workflow I'm calling is going to create the cluster and set the value. Therefore, I don't need to set the value. All right, I'm going to save this folder variable for last for reasons you'll understand here in a few moments. Instead, what I'm going to do is go down and look at these variables. They're all Boolean, so they take true or false, yes or no. Let's see, HA enabled. HA enable is a variable that's going to allow us to specify whether or not we want the new cluster to have vSphere high availability turned on. Now, if I want to let the user make the choice, I'd create an input parameter, or if I want to hard code the workflow to always create HA clusters, I could set up an attribute. In this particular case here, I'm actually going to set up all these Booleans as attributes. For whatever reason, I don't want to give the user control over what characteristics the cluster is going to have. So I'm going to create an attribute. The default name is HA enabled, which that's good enough. I'm going to say no, I don't want HA turned on in this cluster that we're creating. I could say yes. vSphere would need to consume more resources if I said yes, but for our purposes here in this demonstration, no will be fine. On the other hand, for DRS enabled, let's set up our cluster so that DRS is enabled. Again, I'll create an attribute, and I'll say yes this time. These last two variables, I'll go ahead and set up real quickly here. They both have to do with vSAN, virtual SAN. I'm not going to turn on virtual SAN, so I'm going to set both of these to false. So a new variable set to no, and another new variable set to no. Again, I'm running out of white space here. I still have a little sliver to drop on here, but if you run out of white space, don't worry. You can always drag and drop on the header columns up top here. So I'll drop here. New variable called blah, blah, blah. I'm going to set its value to no so that no vSAN functionality is going to be turned on. Again, if I want to change any of these values, I can always go back to the General tab, scroll down to the Attribute section, and set the values differently. But I have them set up the way I want. I want this to create a cluster that only has DRS turned on. Let's take a look at the folder variable. I've saved the folder variable for last because it's the most challenging one of the variables here, but it's also an interesting one. We're going to learn some interesting stuff looking at this. Now, looking at the description below, we see that the folder variable needs us to pass in a vc::host folder. Now, we've actually talked about host folders earlier on in this video series, but I'm just going to save our work here and quickly pop over to give you a very, very quick reminder. So here I am in Orchestrator inventory, and in the hierarchy of objects, again, we saw that in addition to the datacenters folder, which gets created by default when you install a vCenter server, whenever you create a data center, 4 folders get created called host, VM, data store, and network. The one that we're looking for here is called host. That's the host folder. If we were to create a cluster, clusters get created in a host folder, either this one here that's created by default, or you can create your own host folders. The challenge here is that we know that over in the Orchestrator workflow, we're going to need to hook up his folder variable to an attribute of our own, and we're going to need to somehow set the value to point to this host folder. But the challenge here is that this host folder is not going to exist when we run the workflow. In fact, my data center folder, my data center host, and these other 3 folders aren't going to exist at all. They get created on the fly. So there's no way I can set my host folder in the workflow itself, at least not when I first create the variable. Instead, I'm going to have to create a variable to hold the host folder, and I'm going to have to programmatically find that host folder. So hope that makes sense. I'm going to go over to the workflows folder again. I'm going to edit my workflow, and we'll once again reposition a little bit here. Once again, I've selected create cluster, and we need a variable of our own in our workflow that's going to hold this host folder. So I'll go ahead and create an attribute called host folder. And I'm not going to bother setting the value here now, because actually if I go over, I'm not going to bother setting that because in effect the situation that we're in would look kind of like this. I'm over here in the vSphere web client. I'm going to remove my data center folder and everything in there from my inventory, because when I run my workflow, that's not going to exist. So back over in Orchestrator, if I edit my workflow, I'm typing Control E to edit. When I attempt to set the value of that variable, there's nothing to point it to. So I'm not going to bother setting it here as I create the workflow, but rather elsewhere in the workflow, I'm going to set the value of that variable. So just as a quick reminder, the name of the variable that we just created is called host folder. So try as I might, looking throughout my workflow, I'm not going to find the host folder that I'm looking for. There's no existing variable that holds it. I have a variable where I will store it, but I don't have a variable that currently holds the host folder. So maybe I could do something like, well, I need to find the host folder before I call create cluster. So maybe I could call another workflow. Let's search for a workflow that does help me find a host folder. Well, there's create host folder, rename, delete, but I don't want to do those things. I want to find an existing workflow. So, excuse me, existing host folder. So these workflows won't work. Instead of calling an workflow, you might call instead one of these things called an action. Again, I need to call, whether I'm calling a workflow or an action, I need to do so before create cluster, because I need to get that host folder. But try as I might, there's no action that gets you the host folder. As a little aside here, I thought there was, I could swear there was, but in this version of Orchestrator, there doesn't appear to be an action that does that. So we're going to have to do this from scratch. So one way of doing this would be to drag in a scriptable task. And first thing I need to do is name the scriptable task by double-clicking its label. I'm going to call this one get host folder. And to get that host folder, what I'm going to do is edit the schema element and set up its JavaScript to go out and programmatically get the host folder that we're looking for. But in order to write that JavaScript, I need to know something from a tool called the API Explorer. So I'm going to save and close my workflow. I'm going to save and close my workflow and go over to the Tools drop-down menu to find something called the API Explorer. Now, there's more than one way to get into the API Explorer, but for me personally, I like to do it this way. I go to the main screen. Before I do anything in Orchestrator, I go to the main screen, go to Tools, API Explorer, and I get a window that I can move around all I want. I can make it great big if I want, but ultimately, I can go in here and search for things by using the search functionality, or I happen to know exactly what we're looking for. I know that the host folder is something that gets created when we create a data center. So what I'm going to do is look up vc:"datacenter." You'll notice that when I do so, I get back these items with gray dots. You can get to the information we're looking for by going through the gray dot entries here, but gray dot entries, as a beginner, you probably just want to ignore. And instead of searching for vc:"datacenter, if we search for vc:"datacenter, that will find us exactly what we're looking for. So here's vc:"datacenter. If I double click it, it selects it over here on the left side of the screen. If I expand the top left-hand side of the screen, I can see that a data center object has a whole bunch of properties. These entries with the hollow dots are properties. And one of the properties of a data center is its host folder. That's one of the 4 hidden folders I talked about before. If you recall, there are a few others. So if I have a vC data center object and go for its .host folder property, I'll have that data center's host folder. But there's also a VM folder property, a network property, and where's the other one? And a data store. Again, those correspond to the four different folders that get created when you create a data center. These are created for you automatically. And what I'm doing is I'm going to take the data center variable that we created previously in this workflow, and from it I'm going to get that data center's host folder. So to do that, in my workflow, let me go back and edit my workflow. Go back to the Workflows tab. In my workflow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my new scriptable task so that it takes the, again, I'm going to undock the window here so I can see more of what's going on. Resize a bit, reposition. I want to set up one input to this schema element. Specifically, I want to get the newly created data center. Let's see, is this it? No, that's the parent data center folder. I'm looking for the new data center. Close, that's the new data center folder. I'm looking for the new data center. Here it is. I'm going to feed in that new data center. And through some scripting I'm going to do here in a few moments, I'm going to end up creating actually, I'm not going to create a data center. I'm going to look in the data center that we're passing in to get its host folder, and I'm going to save that as an output from this scriptable task as an attribute. Specifically, you'll recall we just created a variable called host folder. That's what I want this schema element to do. So I'm going to set it up so that get host folder, the scriptable task, is going to set a variable called host folder, both inside the workflow and inside our workflow, set a variable called host folder that's got the host folder. So the thing I need to do here is to actually write the code. By the way, this here is the API Explorer. When you're in the scripting window, you can see the API Explorer. I personally prefer this, if I can find it, this bigger version that you see in the background here, because it's just easier for me to work with. But if you want to, you can use this API Explorer in this scripting window. But I usually don't like to do that. In fact, I usually just shrink it down so I can see what's going on. So here I need to write some code. Well, the code, it turns out, is going to be real simple. Host folder, that's the attribute that we want to set, is equal to new data center dot, and then I need to type the property name, which you guys know is host folder. We know that because we saw that in the API Explorer. But as a shortcut, if you have an object such as new data center and you type a period followed by control space, you'll get a drop-down list. These guys that you see here in green are methods that we can call, as opposed to properties. The red guys are properties. So you can scroll and find host folder, or notice you can type a portion of the name of what you're looking for and it'll narrow down the list. But this is the code that we need. Host folder equals new data center.host folder. And because of the binding that we've got set up, that code's going to work because we need to know what the new data center is, and we need to get its host folder property. Now in this particular case, my variable name and the property name are exactly the same. They're both host folder. They don't have to be the same. But when I write the code, I have to know exactly how this property is spelled, including the capitalization, that capital letter F. So now that we've got this, let's try validating our workflow again. Actually, just before I go to really drive this point home. So in my workflow, create data center, let's go to create data center. Create data center creates a new data center and stores that data center in a variable called new data center. Then my new scriptable test takes that new data center, does the code that we saw a few moments ago, and saves the host folder out to an attribute called host folder. And then create cluster is taking that host folder variable that we just set and feeding it into create cluster so that it can create a new cluster. So that's what's going on behind the scenes, but let's validate the workflow. Workflow looks good. Let's run the workflow. Actually, just before I do, I'm going to go over to the vSphere web client and make certain that I've already gotten rid of the existing data center folder. I'll type in my input parameters, click submit, and the workflow starts running. And in fact, the workflow is already done. Let's go over to the vSphere web client and see what happened. In the vSphere web client, we've got a new data center folder, has a data center in it, has a cluster, but the cluster is currently empty. So we're making good progress here, but we want to add a host to this cluster. So to do that, I only have so many hosts in this environment. Let me go find one. I'm going to steal away from this cluster. I'm going to steal away this host called esx03a.corp.local. To make certain that's easy to do, the first thing I'm going to do in the vSphere web client is to disconnect that host. So yes, disconnect that host. Don't worry, all the VMs that are on that host still exist. They're still running. And I'm going to remove that host from the vCenter inventory. Yes, I want to do this. Again, don't worry, the host still exists, the VMs on it still exist, the VMs are still running, everything's fine. The host is just no longer being managed by any vCenter servers. So I want to take that host called esx-03a and add it to our new cluster. But again, this is going to be a cluster that's created on the fly, so let me get rid of that hierarchy. So my data center folder and the things in there are now gone. We're going to go back to our workflow and we're going to add more to it. Now I'm going to get rid of this section over here because it's just taking up space on the screen and things are kind of getting a little wide here. So let me scoot some things around here. So in the next part of my code, what I want to do is to add a host to a cluster. Again, you know multiple ways of finding that workflow. I happen to know that the workflow is called add host to cluster. Single click it, double check, is that the right workflow? Yes, it is. So double click it. I'm going to undock the window so we can see what's going on. And as you can see, this workflow that we're calling add host to cluster has some inputs, it has one output. Let's go ahead and save the output. So the output's going to be a new host system. So when we add the host to the cluster, we're going to have as an output the host itself in case we want to do something with that host. So I'm going to create a new attribute for that host system. And these defaults all look fine. For the same usual reason, I'm not setting the value because my workflow is going to set the value. But I have all these other inputs, including one that has been automatically bound. Sometimes the bindings are going to be correct when they're automatically guessed. Other times they're going to be wrong. But you should always either delete the auto-guessed bindings or do what I'm going to do here, which is to double check, is this right? Let's see. So add a host to a cluster needs to know what cluster to put that host in. And this is our new cluster variable. They're the same type, or this binding wouldn't have occurred at all. But that new cluster sounds like exactly what we want to feed into this add host to cluster. So that binding was correct. As you can see, we have a bunch of other inputs. We have one called as connected. Let me pop over here to create an attribute, and the description says pretty well what this Boolean variable does. So when this host is added to the cluster, do you want it immediately connected? Well, yeah, I do. It's hard for me to think of a reason why I wouldn't, but I'm going to say yes here. So that variable's set up. And we also have another variable called force. We'll get back to resource in a little bit, but force is also another Boolean variable. Again, creating an attribute. Again, I'm going to say yes, but the basic idea behind the force Boolean is Instead of having to have previously done the steps I did before in the web client with disconnecting and removing the host, if you choose force yes, then the host will be stolen away from any vCenter server it's currently connected to. All right, so continuing onwards here, host name. This variable is going to hold the name of the host that we want added to the cluster. Now I could ask the user, by creating an input parameter, I could ask the user the name of that host, but I'm just going to hard code this as an attribute. So host name, and I'm going to hard code it because otherwise I'm going to forget this. The host name is esx-03a.corp.local, and all the rest of this stuff looks good, so I'll hit OK. Port number is an easy one. That's just the port number that the vCenter server is listening on. So port is 443. And username is simple. You guys know that when you connect to a host, you connect as a user called root. I could ask the user to specify that by creating an input parameter, but I'm going to hard code root by creating an attribute. I'll hard code it as root, and we'll leave the rest as defaults. Password, I am going to force the user to specify the password. So I create an input parameter. This is the, what should I call this variable? Host password, ESXi password. How about ESXi host password? And the user is going to set the value for that. All right, what next? VM folder, I'll get back to in a moment. License, let's set that up. So in order to add the host needs to be licensed. So I'm going to, I don't want to force the user to type the license, so I'm going to create a new attribute and I'm going to set the value here. And we'll hit OK. Now, as you can see, we've set up all of our input parameters except for 2, along with the output parameter, but we still need to set the 2 input parameters that are left unset. Now, these are both challenging in the same way that it was challenging to set up the host folder. VM folder, we already know, we already saw where to get the VM folder. We're going to have to write some code to do that, but we already know how to get the VM folder. The data center object has a property called .vm folder. We just need to go get that. We could create another scriptable task to do that, but we're actually going to do this a little differently this time. We're going to create something called an action, because we may want to be able to get this VM folder at different places in this workflow or other workflows. So the same challenge to getting host folder, we've got to deal with that with VM folder, and same thing with this one called resource pool. But what's going to be different about resource pool, we got to write some code to get it, but we're not going to be able to get that code. We're not going to be able to get the resource pool from the data center object because that's not where you get that info. But let's start simple. We're going to do the same sort of thing we just did with host folder, but for VM folder. So we're going to create an attribute called VM folder. We'll just go with the default name. And we're not going to set the value in this scriptable, in this workflow that we're calling. Instead, we're going to do something similar to what we did with get host folder, except instead of creating another scriptable task that has code like you see here, what we're going to do instead is create something called an action. And what's nice about action, there's actually a number of things that are nice about actions, but one of the things that's nice about actions is these scriptable tasks are not readily reusable. If the scriptable task, if I want to use it elsewhere in this workflow, I could copy it and paste it in this workflow, but I might want to call this same code in the scriptable task in some other workflow. And there's no way to do that with a scriptable task. So we're going to learn how to create a action starting right now. So to create an action, we have to get out of the workflow editor and go over to the Actions tab. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of folders. They're actually called modules, but whether you call them folders or modules, there's a whole bunch of folders that are organized. As you can see, they all begin with something like com.vmware. In other words, reverse your domain name and then create whatever other hierarchy that you want in the rest of the name. So for instance, my domain name is vvork.info. So I'm going to create a new module called info.vvork. So you should go ahead and create your own module and begin all the modules you create with your domain name in reverse order. That way you won't collide with anybody else's. And if you want, you can have just one big module that holds all your actions, or maybe you want to start dividing them up into different modules. So for instance, I'm going to put all my actions that do vSphere type things into this module called info.vvork.vSphere. Anyways, I'm going to create a new module. Here's my module, but as you can see, it's empty. There's nothing in it. So right-click the workflow, choose Add Action, and give your action a name. Now what this action is going to do is it's going to get the VM folder from a data center. The users, whoever calls this workflow, is going to pass in a data center, and we're going to give them back the VM folder for that data center. So name the action, then give it a good description, because whoever is calling your workflow is going to need to know what this action does. They shouldn't have to edit your workflow. They shouldn't have to edit your action to see what it does. So type a good description, such as this action, actually do it this way, given a data center object as a VC : data center object as input, this action returns that data center's VM folder. That's a good description. And also do consider setting up versioning on your actions. I'm going to keep it simple right now and just create version 001. I'm going to say this is the initial version. But as I create my workflows, I ought to update the versions and the comments associated with them. Okay, so we've got a good name for our action, a good description, and what we're going to do next is go to the scripting tab. Our action needs one input. It needs a data center to go looking in. So I'm going to create a variable called data center. And that alone is a pretty good name. The user will probably understand what I'm asking for. Whoever's calling my action will understand what I'm asking for, because that's a good variable name. But to be really certain that they know what I'm asking for, in the description I could type, I could be simple and just say data center, and that's all they'll see, and maybe that's enough. But how about data center in which to find the VM folder that we're looking for? Again, you could type whatever you want, but I'm just going to say data center with the VM folder. That's good enough. But crucially here, our input parameter, our one and only, if we had multiple input parameters, you could add more, but we have one input parameter and we need to set its type. We're not going to ask for the data center by name. That a string would be good for that. Instead, we're going to ask for a vC : data center. Not a data center folder, but a data center. My action now requires one input parameter of type vC : data center. My action is going to return something. Void means it returns nothing. Mine's not going to return nothing. It's going to return, click on void, it's going to return a vC : VM folder. All right, so I'm in good shape here. My action knows that it has one input parameter, it has one output parameter. Actions only ever have 1 or 0 outputs. But I still have to write some code. Again, to figure out the code, I could go into the API Explorer here, or as you know, I've got the great big version of the API Explorer over here. But one way or another, I need to find out the code I need to type, which in this case is pretty straightforward. It's going to be VM folder equals the data center. This variable name here needs to match what we have up here. So that's a little different. There we go. Notice the color changed, and so I know that this is in fact the right name for that variable. It's not going to return the host folder, it's going to return the VM folder, but we're going to return it differently. Previously, when we did a scriptable task, we said variable name equals object.host folder. In this case, what we need to do, since this is an action, is we need to return datacenter.vm folder. Now, for me personally, I like putting that in parentheses. I'm not certain I can give a good reason for doing that, other than it's just stylistically, I like it better that way. You can instead just say return space datacenter.vm folder semicolon. But that's it. That's my whole action. It just looks into the data center that the user is passing in. And when I say the user, I mean whoever's calling your action. Looks in the data center that got passed in, goes to the VM folder property, and returns that. And if we do that, we now have an action that will work for our purposes. Now I'm going to real quickly here duplicate this action. I'm going to call this next action get host folder. I didn't like doing the scriptable task approach to getting the host folder before, so I'm going to create an action called get host folder from data center. It's going to do essentially the same thing. We just need to change a few things about it. So when we edit this new action, I need to make certain it's got a good name. I need it to have a good description. That looks good. And I need to change the code around a bit. This time it's still going to take a data center as input, but the output's not going to be a VM folder. It's going to be a vc::host folder, which I apparently somehow mistyped. A vc::host folder. And then correspondingly, our code needs to change a little bit too. And don't forget to change that description up there. Okay. So all I did there was really quickly create another action for getting host folders. All right, so now we've got a couple of actions. We'll go back to our workflow. We'll edit the workflow. And again, before we can add the host to a cluster, we need to get the VM folder for, let me just bring this up here. We need to get the VM folder. So we already have a variable called VM folder. If you look down below, we've got a variable called VM folder, but we need to put something in there. We could do the scriptable task approach again, but instead we're going to do an action element. And again, I'm positioning it right here because I have to call this action before I can add the host to the cluster, and I have to call this action sometime after create data center. So I could call it here, I could call it here, I could call it here, but it has to be before add host to cluster, but also after create data center. Right here seems like a good place, so I'm going to do it here. So what are we going to call? We're going to call get VM folder from data center. Single click it, double check. Yep, that's the right one. Double click. And we need to hook it up. Again, when you hook up an action, I'm going to undock here so I can see what I'm doing. When you hook up an action, it's got the same sort of deal as when you call a workflow. You just specify, okay, the data center that we're going to go looking in is a certain one. Now you'll recall, I think we had multiple vC::data centers. There's this, now that's the data center folder. Let me scroll down so I can see it. Hang on. Select the action. So we want a vC::data center. I'm going to do this the hard way. Let me break the binding. If you've never noticed this before, notice that visually, through several different visual clues, Orchestrator is helping me to find the right variable. So this is the new data center. I'm just going to scroll down. Notice it will scroll automatically. Yep, nothing else could possibly be the right variable. So I'm going to go pick the one that it automatically guessed, and I'll set up that binding. Every time you create an action, if the action returns a value, it always returns the value in a variable called action result, which, since you're going to be calling multiple actions, you should change the name, not in the action, not here, but you should change the name as you bind to your attribute. So I'm going to either create a new variable to bind to the action result, or in this case here, you'll recall we previously created a variable called VM folder. So now this new action takes a data center and returns a vC::VM folder. And if I really don't like that scriptable task approach, I can do the same thing here. I'm going to get rid of that scriptable task by dragging in an action element. This one's going to call get host folder. That's the right one. I'm going to bind it much the same way I just did. So has it guessed the right data center? Yep, that's the right one. And we're going to bind to host folder. Having done that, I shouldn't need this scriptable task anymore. And I'm feeling pretty confident here. I'm just going to scoot things around a bit to make my workflow a little prettier. I still have something left to do in add host to cluster. That's why we have the red circle with the X in it over there. So we still have something left to do in add host to cluster. Now, if you don't know what that problem is, whenever you see the red circle with the white X in it, you can hit validate to find out what the problem is. Oh, there's a parameter called resource pool. We haven't bound to it. Okay, we knew that already. But let's go set up the resource pool. The challenge here is the resource pool. I can create a new attribute. Why don't we go ahead and do that? I can create a new attribute, give it a name. That's a good name, good description, blah, 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 blah. But I can't set the value because I can't do it right now because the resource pool I'm trying to find is a resource pool of the new cluster that's being created by this workflow. That cluster doesn't exist yet, so I can't set this now. Instead, I'm going to have to either create a scriptable task or an action to get the resource pool. The added challenge here is that resource pool is not a property of the data center like we saw before. For host folder and VM folder, those are properties of a data center. Resource pool, on the other hand, is a property of another type of object. I know what it is, and if you were listening carefully before, you heard me say what it is, but let's imagine you didn't know where that resource pool property is defined. So to find it, you could always go back to the API Explorer and search for, let's search for, let me resize this here. I can't see the left side. For some reason, I can't see all my API Explorer, but let's try this anyways. Resource pool actually shows up in a number of different objects, including, I don't even know what GEF is. So I'm actually looking for something VC something. So if need be, I'll go searching through each of these. They're alphabetical, by the way, if you haven't ever noticed that before. Okay, interesting. Not quite certain why I'm not seeing it here just yet. I know what the answer is, so I'm going to take you a slightly different way. Let me go back to the API Explorer. I know that in vCenter, we have a whole bunch of objects. These are alphabetized, by the way. If you've never noticed that, they're alphabetized. It'll help you find what you're looking for. I'm looking for vC::cluster compute resource. The resource pool is a member of the cluster. So here's vC::cluster compute resource, and one of the properties of that is resource pool. So there we go. That's good. So if you want to, go ahead and write the action yourself, but I'll show you how to do it. So I'm going to say new action. So I'm back on the Actions tab. I right-click my module, choose Add Action. My action is going to be called Get Resource Pool from not a data center this time, but rather from a cluster compute resource, which I'm just going to abbreviate from cluster. Let's see. Let's set up our initial version. Let's type a good description. Okay, so we've typed a good description. We need one input parameter. It's going to be a cluster. type my description. I could be more descriptive than this here, but this alone should be enough. I'll tell you what, cluster with the resource pool. And the type is not string. The type is vc : cluster compute resource. This action is going to return a resource pool, specifically a vc : resource pool. And now we just need our code. Our code is going to return something. Specifically, it's going to return cluster dot. Again, control space will help you to find what you're looking for instead of using the API Explorer. I know I'm looking for a resource pool. There it is. There's resource pool. And boom, I've got my new action. I'll save and close my action. We'll go back to the Workflows tab. I'll edit my workflow. And in addition to getting the VM folder from the data center, we're going to call another action that's going to get the resource pool. Hang on, grab the wrong one. We're going to call another action. And this action is going to get the resource pool. Get resource pool from there. There's my new action. Looks like the right one. Double click it. Again, we need to set up its bindings, but you know how to do that. Notice it's automatically and correctly guessed the binding for the cluster. We just need to save action result, not as a variable called action result, but we've already created a variable called, let's see, scroll down. Nope. Scroll. There we go. Boom, done. Whew. All right, so looking at our workflow now, let me shrink it a bit so you can see it all. Our workflow is pretty straightforward. It's got a number of different steps, but it's not doing anything too terribly difficult. If I go to my workflow, either in the editor or out here, I can run the workflow. Just before I do, I'm going to go back to the vSphere web client to make certain that I'm not going to bump into any existing data center folders or data centers and so forth, but we should be in good shape here. Let's run the workflow. Let's see, the name of the data center folder is my data center folder. The new data center is going to be called my data center. The cluster is going to be called my cluster, and the super secret password for the ESXi host is VMware1 bang. Let's click submit. Watch our workflow run. I'm watching it run here. I can see it's running. While we wait for it, this one's going to take longer because it takes longer to create the cluster and add hosts to the cluster. But let's go over to vSphere web client and see what's happening so far. So we've got our new data center folder. We've got our new data center. We've got our new cluster. And you can see it has added in the host and picked up some VMs along the way. These are the VMs that were on that host. Let's go back to Orchestrator. As you can see, it completed successfully. So, as you can see, we've done a lot here in terms of learning how to do things that are vSphere related. So we know how to look up and call workflows. We know how to look up and or create actions that we want to call. We know how to call things in the right sequence. We know that, for instance, we have to call this action before we can create the cluster, but before we can create the action, we have to have called create data center. So we learned a lot in this example for how to create a workflow that does vSphere related things. But I do want to emphasize, and you can find this out either by going through the API Explorer or where the other place I'm about to go. Okay, so I'm going to go to code.vmware.com. In here, there's a lot of useful information. If you're interested in more about what's going on with the vSphere calls that we've been doing, this vSphere Management SDK section is excellent. But there's also another section here called API Explorer. It's not exactly the same thing as the API Explorer we see in Orchestrator. They're similar, but this API Explorer talks about more than just vSphere, and it goes into lots of detail. So if you go to API Explorer, as you can see, VMware has tons of different APIs for our various products. Some products have multiple APIs just for a single product. But for instance, there's API documentation here for how to do things with NSX, our VMware's network virtualization technology, or we've been doing things related to vCenter specifically. So there's vCloud Director, View, and so forth. But the stuff that we've been doing is actually down here. There's vRealize automation. So if you're interested in doing calls to any of a gazillion different VMware products, the API documentation that you see here will help you to learn how to do that. But again, focusing on vSphere as an example, let's go look at the documentation for the vSphere APIs. The API that we've been using in our workflow that we've been developing is specifically called the vSphere Web Service API. If we look here, you can see there are multiple versions. We want the version of the API for the version of vSphere we're working with, so I'll click on the 6.5 link here. And what you see in this API documentation is, let's give it a moment here. Different APIs behave differently, so not everything I say here is going to be applicable to all the APIs, but much of it is. When you go into the vSphere Web Service API, that's the API that your vSphere web client is using to talk to vCenter. It's the same API that the HTML5 client's using. It's the same API that PowerCLI uses. It's the same API that Orchestrator uses. So if you understand how to use this API for one of those technologies, you can use it for any of them. So with the vSphere Web Service API, as you can see here, it defines different types of objects. The one that you are going to be most interested in the beginning is this one here called Manage Object Types. So manage objects, if you want a good explanation of manage objects, you might want to go take a look at a book by a former colleague of mine. His name's Steve Jin, S-T-E-V-E, last name Jin, J-I-N. If you search for Steve Jin, you'll see he's got a book on the vSphere Web Service. Admittedly, that book is from vSphere 4.0 days, but it's still widely applicable. There have been changes. There are differences between the 4.x version of this API and the 6.5 version that you'll be using nowadays, but that book is still very informative. You don't have to read the whole book. It's about 400 pages long. The first 100 pages are what you'd want to read through. They talk about the vSphere Web Service API. The last 300 pages talks about a Java version of that API, which we don't need to know for Orchestrator. All right, so managed objects. Again, Steve does a great job of explaining what they are. I'm going to give you an easy way to think of the managed objects. All of the following things that I'm about to mention are managed objects. A VM is a managed object. A host is a managed object. A data center is a managed object. A cluster is a managed object. A data store, I think I already said that. All the usual vSphere objects that you are used to working with in the vSphere web client or other tools like that, those are all managed objects. So since those are the objects that you want to work with in your Orchestrator workflows, you want to know about the managed object types. So for instance, if I go to section C here, we can find, where's cluster compute resource? There's cluster compute resource. Or if I go into D, I'll find data center and data center folder and data store. But I want to take you to an object that you're going to know. Let's go to V, and in V, we've got virtual machine. So a virtual machine is described by an managed object. Over in Orchestrator, we call that object VC:virtual machine. Here in the API documentation, we can see exactly what's going on with that object. And what we're going to see here is very similar to what Orchestrator's API Explorer would show you, but this API Explorer is more extensive and it's more up to date. So if I click on virtual machine or any of these other objects, the documentation over here on the right side describes a VC:virtual machine object. The object, VC:virtual machine, is a property of lots of other objects. So for instance, let me find one that would be a good example here. One of the properties of a data store object is an array of the VMs that are stored in that data store. So you don't have to understand all these other objects that have vC: virtual machine as a property, but if you understand that so much so far, take a look at these others and you can perhaps find some interesting things. Similarly, this section here defines, actually doesn't define, it enumerates all of the methods that require a vC: virtual machine as a parameter when you call that method. This list here gives you a list of all of the methods that return a vC: virtual machine. So for instance, if you call clone VM underscore task, let's just call that clone VM. If you call clone VM, then that method is going to return a vC: virtual machine. This is not the time to go into details, but any of these methods that end in underscore task are asynchronous methods. If you know what an asynchronous method is, then you know what underscore task means. For the rest of you, if you don't know what asynchronous means, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Just understand that these are the methods that return virtual machines. These are the methods that need you to pass in a virtual machine. These are the objects that have a property that points to one or more virtual machines. And there's another section down here called See Also. This is just miscellaneous stuff that could be of interest. But there's this other part here labeled Extends. I'll explain that in a moment. So there's a description of this object, blah, 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 and then a properties table. So all the different property names that you see here are accessible in a vC: virtual machine object. So for instance, if you want to, if you have a variable in Orchestrator, let's say it's a variable called myVM, and let's suppose that myVM is a vC: virtual machine. If myVM is holding a virtual machine, if in your Orchestrator workflow, if you are writing JavaScript in something such as a scriptable task, if you say myVM.guest, you'll get information about the guest operating system in that virtual machine. And there are lots of other interesting properties in here. For instance, if you want to know what data store the virtual machine is stored in, you can go through this property, which is actually an array. That's what the square brackets mean here. An array of data stores. You can find out what networks the VM's plugged into. You can find out what resource pool it belongs to. You can start playing around with the snapshots for that virtual machine if it has any, and so forth. But there are, in order to understand the layout of the vC: virtual machine object, you have to understand that it in turn points to other objects. So for instance, if you want to know what the layout of a snapshot is, again, that's a vC: virtual machine snapshot info structure. You can go back in the API Explorer and look that one up. But one of the properties that you don't see here that you would expect to see is a property called .name. I'll explain why .name isn't here in just a moment. But just before I do, this section here is also important. This table here defines the methods that are available on a vC: virtual machine object. So for instance, if you have that variable called myVM, if you say in your JavaScript code in Orchestrator, if you say myVM.poweronVM underscore task, that will power on the virtual machine. All right, so I just said a moment ago that the name property is missing here. Even though a virtual machine object has a name property, you don't see it here in the documentation. And in fact, there will be other properties that you don't see because they're not defined. The .name property and some other properties are not defined as a property directly assigned to virtual machine, but rather they're assigned to a higher level object called a managed entity. All the managed objects such as vC: virtual machine, vC: data store, vC: host system, they all have a .name property instead of defining the .name property on each of those different types of objects, the .name property and all the common properties and common methods that all managed objects have are defined in this higher level object called managed entity. If we go look at managed entity has a property called, where's it hiding? Called name. So that's a bit of background in the API Explorer. Admittedly, there's a lot more to use in the API Explorer than this quick introduction, but hopefully I've gotten you pointed in the right direction. Again, you might want to take a look at Steve Jen's now admittedly somewhat out of date book, but it's still great info. And that, I think, for the time being, as far as creating a hierarchy of objects in the vCenter world, I think we've tackled a lot. So I'm going to wrap up this video. Again, I hope this has been useful. Again, this has been a bit of a stream of consciousness as approach to teaching you how to do this. If parts of it, if it all made sense, great. If the parts didn't make sense, feel free to go back and take a look. Feel free to fire up a lab environment in the hands-on lab and actually try the things I'm doing. You can always hit pause. I know I'm going kind of quickly. I try to make the video quick for people who are just watching, but if you're trying to go through these examples yourself, feel free, fire up a lab environment at the hands-on labs and go through this step by step, hit pause the video and do the things and think about what I'm having you do as you do them. But that takes us to the end of this particular demonstration and the end of this 10-part video series. If you found this helpful, great. I do these videos because I try to give back to the community, but also please consider joining me in the classroom. I'm a principal instructor at VMware. I, along with our other instructors, teach about all sorts of VMware topics. If you have interest in our courses, feel free to contact us or see us on our webpage at www.vmware.com/education. So this has been an admittedly long video. I thank you very much for your time and attention. If you've got any feedback, let me know in the comments below, but thank you for watching this video and come back to vvork.info periodically. There will be more and more videos as time unfolds. So thanks everyone.